Okay, now for the sermon today, I'm going to begin with a dog story. I like dog stories because I like dogs pretty well. The last time that I had any interaction with the sheriff or sheriff's deputy, I was coming out of a Target store in Vancouver. I walked over to my truck. My dog was in the truck, and the sheriff had his dog in his vehicle, but he had his dog outside, probably getting some exercise. So we started up a conversation about dog training. And of course, not being humble about my dog, I told my dog to come out, and I put her through all the paces, come, stop, go, left, right, whatever. And so the officer was happy that we were able to talk about dog training, and he mentioned the dog training that the police dogs have and that kind of thing. So that was a lot of fun. But today I want to tell you about a little white poodle, an obnoxious little dog who was at times fun to be around, but also very irritating. He was a little poodle that a couple here in the Vancouver church, many of you would remember, had for many years, a little white dog. And what he would do is kind of half do whatever he was told to do. If he was told to go sit in his box, he would go to the front of the box and just stand there and look at you, or his owner. And everything that he was told to do, whether it was to take care of personal needs or to do something, he would sort of half do it. He would go over and kind of do just enough to where he thought he wouldn't get in trouble, but he never really completely obeyed. Dogs do that. They get to a place in life where hopefully a little later they learn to just want to please their master. So we ended up nicknaming this the Protestant dog because he always partially obeyed. So as many churches do, they sort of partially obey. It's a sin that we all have to be very careful of, whether we obey God completely or whether we just sort of partially obey, enough that in our mind we've sort of accomplished what we're supposed to, but we really haven't from the heart obeyed what God wanted us to do. I want to begin today with an account of someone who had that serious problem over in 1 Samuel chapter 15. We have an account here of a man who was told by God to go do a certain job. And this is after several other trials in his life that we'll have a chance to look at, see what led up to it. But in 1 Samuel chapter 15, we have an account of God telling King Saul, through the final prophet Samuel, that he was supposed to go kill some Amalekites. 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore heed the voice of the words of the Lord." Now, this was the third trial that this king was put through. God often has 3 times of testing. It's like Peter 3 times denied Christ. Paul 3 times prayed that the affliction that was afflicting him would go away. And, of course, quite a number of other examples in the Bible. Verse 2, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way to Egypt, and he came on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek, utterly destroy all they have, and do not spare them." And of course, we know what Saul did. He went and partly he defeated Amalek, but kept many of the spoils, the sheep, the goats, the good animals, and of course some of the gold and silver and other plunder for himself. The question we want to ask first, though, is why? Why did God have the Amalekites to be destroyed? Well, let's pause here and go back and get some background. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 17. Deuteronomy chapter 25, of course, is part of the final book of Moses. Moses is giving, in his last month of his life, a history of what had happened to the people of Israel, how God had brought them out of Egypt with a high hand and miraculous events, and had then also been able to keep them from forgive them for all of their evils and all the things they did during their 40 years of testing, and then, of course, brought them into the promised land, or was on the verge of bringing them into the promised land. In Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 17, he says, "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt, how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear, when you were tired and weary, and he did not fear God. Therefore it shall be when the Lord your God has given you rest from your enemies all around, in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, that you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, you shall not forget. Now, Amalek was a descendant of Esau. Esau swore to kill Jacob. And that hatred and that animosity between those two bloodlines apparently found its fulfillment in Amalek. And one of the last things that Moses told the people of Israel was to be sure when they came into the promised land to destroy the Amalekites. Now let's go back to Exodus chapter 17. This is the first account of the Amalekites. Exodus chapter 17. You know, if you go over to Israel today, which of course you can't because of the travel restrictions, but let's say back when you could, the taxi drivers and those who give rides over there, used to be they were under law. They had to stop for any soldier who was standing on the curb needing a ride. When I was there for the dig in 1974, of course this was only 8 months after the Yom Kippur War, and we were driving along in our bus full of Ambassador College students, and there would be a bus in front of us of Israeli soldiers that would stop, and they would get out on the sidewalk, and every car, sometimes 3 or 4 lanes worth, every car stopped, because by law they had to pick up the Israeli soldiers and take them home or take them where they were going. And at that point, the soldiers were often deployed for a day, home for a day, deployed for a day, home for a day. It was a lot of motion day and night by the Israeli army. But what is interesting is that when a taxi driver or another would drop off the Israeli soldier wherever he goes, and even today when they drop off their fellow Jews, they don't say, thank you for the tip, or have a good day, or what do we say in America, have a good one. You know what they say? They say, you remember the Amalekites. And so the Jews, even to this day, remind themselves in the land of Israel, which is constantly under threat, that they should not forget the Amalekites, those sons of Esau who swore to kill them. And so we never had any say that to us because I never took a taxi over there. I guess we did last time we were there. But they say to each other, remember the Amalekites. Now in Exodus chapter 17, we have a beginning of the history of the Amalekites. It says, when all the congregation of the children of Israel set on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, they camped in Rephidim. But there was no water for the people there to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. So Moses said to them, why do you contend with me? So here we have Moses crying out to God in verse 4 for water. And this is the first time they needed water. And in this case, God did tell Moses to strike the rock with his staff. The second time they needed water, I think at Merah, he told them to speak to the rock, but Moses hit the rock with his staff instead. And so because of that presumption, he was unable to go into the promised land, and Joshua had to lead the people in. But in verse 5, the Lord said to Moses, go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river, and go. I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. So apparently the pillar of cloud was the being who became Jesus Christ. The rock that followed Israel was right there by the rock, and Moses struck the rock, and water came out. Notice verse 8, Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, come, choose us some men, go out, fight with Amalek tomorrow, and I will stand on top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up the hill with him. So it was when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands became heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Now this is before arriving at Mount Sinai and before the giving of the 10 Commandments and the covenant being made between Israel and God. Verse 14, the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And so Moses built an altar and called its name, the Lord is my banner. In other words, the banner under which they fight battles. For he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. So the Amalekites apparently were fearful warriors, but in this case they chose to attack the Israelites from the back, attacking women and children and those who were old and stragglers and unable to keep up with the main army. Not entirely different than some of the terrorist tactics of the previous generations. You may remember back when, I think it was when Netanyahu in his first time as prime minister had an entire wall in his office that occasionally was shown on the news. And it was over 400 Israeli children that had been killed in bombings during the Intifada, ranging from newborn babies up to kids about 10 or 12 years old. And it was truly emotional and heartbreaking to see all of those children, all their pictures that were on the wall in his office. So the Amalekites' strategy hasn't changed, and certainly the feeling that God would have about some of them maybe would be the same, although thankfully in the world tomorrow they'll all be called by God and all of these breaches will be healed. Now I want to drop over to Judges chapter 3. Judges chapter 3 and verse 13. The Amalekites were also used by God to punish Israel for disobedience. That during the times of the judges, when finally it became pretty much like it is in our nation today, where everybody did what was right in their own sight, didn't follow God or God's ways. We have in the book of Judges, during some of those times of disobedience, that God allowed the Amalekites to punish Israel for disobedience. Judges chapter 3 and verse 13 says, "He gathered to himself the people of Ammon and Amalek and went and defeated Israel and took possession of the city of palms," which, by the way, is called Jericho. Jericho is the city of palms right down on the flat level area of the plain of the Jordan River, just north of the Dead Sea. So the children of Israel served Eglon, king of Moab, 18 years. And so Eglon, king of Moab, recruited help from the Ammonites and the Amalekites. And so God allowed those people, the Amalekites, to punish Israel when they were disobedient. Over in chapter 6, it says, "Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Midianites." Verse 3 says, "When Israel came out, or whatever Israel had sown, the Midianites would come up, also Amalekites, and the people of the east would come up against them. And they would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance for Israel." So we have people coming up, stealing animals, stealing crops. Verse 5, "They would come up with their livestock on their tents, coming in as numerous as locusts. Both they and their camels were there without number. And they would enter the land to destroy it. Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children cried out to the Lord." So the Amalekites stole, they left a lot of destruction in their wake. They left Israel in poverty. And of course, the sins of Israel came to their forefront, and they began then to repent. And God sent them repeatedly judges who relieved them from the oppression of their enemies. So here we have kind of a background of the Amalekites and how God then, we get to the point where God wants King Saul to actually fulfill this vow that Moses had made, and God had made essentially, that God made through Moses to have them put away. Let's go back to 1 Samuel. Actually, let's go back to 1 Samuel 13. 1 Samuel 13. What we find in the life of King Saul is a gradual increase in his ability to partially obey. And yet to convince himself, perhaps to convince others who were listening to him, that he really was obeying God. It's a very bad pattern. It's one that hopefully we take a personal warning from. Human reasoning, human rationalization is what it is. And of course, people always want to rationalize that they are doing right in their own eyes. 1 Samuel chapter 13, let's begin in verse 1. "Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, he chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel." So this is the very beginning of Saul's reign. This is after he had been chosen by the people of Israel, basically by God, because he was tall. He was one who could be a very visible king. Apparently he was good at physical things, fighting. He was very athletic. And of course he then reigned for a couple of years here after he had been chosen. He began to attack the Philistines and try to relieve the oppressions of the Philistines over Israel. Let's go down to verse 5. Then the Philistines gathered together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen. This is a very large army. And people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. So a very, very large army that the Philistines were able to put together. And they came up and encamped in Michmash to the east of Beth-aven. And the men of Israel saw they were in danger, for the people were distressed. And the people hid in caves, in thickets, in rocks, in holes, and in pits. So here we have the people of Israel, the army of Israel, terrified. And they are sort of running and hiding in places, hoping to save themselves from this great onslaught of this Philistine army. Some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. And as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Now, Gilgal was where the tabernacle had been set up temporarily. The tent had been set up there. And he was waiting for a priest to come and give an offering and to sacrifice an animal, because they would always seek God's blessing and God's help before going into a battle. It says, then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come. So Samuel didn't come by the appointed day or time that he was supposed to come. And the people were scattered from him. So Saul sees that Samuel's not here. The people are all scattering, running away. His army is dissolving before his eyes. He doesn't know what to do, so he makes the wrong decision. Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me. Now, he was not qualified to give the offering. He simply assumed that he was going to. He just said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. It's called presumptuous sins. That's what one of the Psalms that King David wrote, said, keep me from presumptuous sins. So Saul said, bring me an offering, peace offerings, and he offered the burnt offering. Now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. Now Samuel knew what he had done, and Samuel said to him, what have you done? Saul said, well, when I saw that the people were scattered from me, and you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Now, the answer, of course, would have simply been to have fasted and prayed and asked for God to deliver him and wait for God's answer. But instead, he used human reason, human rationalization, and came up with his own way to please God, own way to worship God. It says, therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. So this is so often illustrated today that people mix the teachings of the Bible with human reason. Say, well, God says this, well, we're going to do it this way, whatever. There's so many ramifications of that or examples, we could spend days with it. But I think you'll find that if you would read certain books, I've got a book at home called Religions of America, and what this author did, this is a fairly old book, probably 30 years. He had each one of the, authorities and in quite a number of American churches write their basic doctrines, because we have our own booklet on our basic doctrines, as many people do. It's amazing reading through it how many of them say human reason tempers scriptures, that we have to understand the scriptures as being interpreted by current conditions and human reasoning and human ideas. Well, that's what Saul did. So Samuel said to Saul in verse 13, this is a great idea. You should always try to interpret what God says according to what you really want. It's not what he said. He says, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, for which he commanded you. Now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. So one qualification to ruling in God's kingdom is to follow what God says specifically. We don't turn to the right or to the left or change things to accommodate our own ideas and our own wishes or needs at the time. Verse 14, your kingdom shall not continue, but the Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord has commanded him to be a commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Now, we don't have much record here of what the Lord commanded Saul at this point, except to be a king and rule in the fear of God. But very clearly, Samuel understood and gave him a message from God that he had disqualified himself from ruling because he did not follow what God said to do. Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people presented with him about 600 men. And of course, God did perform a miracle here. Thankfully, he was answering Saul's request, Samuel's request, and Jonathan's bravery and that of his armor bearer ended up being used by God to spare the people of Israel. Now let's go to chapter 14. Here we have an example of, what was that famous Frank Sinatra song, I Did It My Way? I think that Elvis sang that, and probably a number of others recorded that song, I Did It My Way. We used to do a parody of that at church fun shows, and it was kind of, funny. But don't worry, I'm not going to be singing I Did It My Way while I'm up here today. But anyway, that's kind of a long-standing human tradition to be proud of doing it my way, even when my way turns out to be a complete failure, which is what happened in this case. So in 1 Samuel 14, in verse 20, here was a battle going on. Verse 19, let's go to verse 18. Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God here. For at that time the ark of God was with the children of Israel. It had not been taken over to the Philistine camp yet. It happened while Saul talked to the priest that the noise which was in the camp of the Philistines continued to increase. And Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. So Saul and all the people who were with him assembled, and they went to the battle. And indeed every man's sword was against his neighbor, and there was very great confusion. So here we have a battle going on. Saul did not ask for God's intervention. In fact, he pretty much asked the priest to leave. Verse 21, wherever the Hebrews who were with the priest before that time went with them into the camp from the surrounding country, and they also joined the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. So here we have some of the priests that came with them. So Saul here then is in this battle, and it's not going well. Likewise, all the men of Israel who had hidden in the mountains of Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines fled, they also followed hard after them in the battle. So here the tide of the battle is turning. The people of Israel are coming back from the hills where they were scattered and trying to save themselves in fear. And they came back and tried to defeat the Philistines after Jonathan and his armor bearer had put terror into them and won the battle on that hilltop. Verse 24 of 23, the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle shifted to Beth-aven. And the men of Israel were distressed that day. Notice Saul had placed the people under oath, saying, cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies. Now, there's a whole lot wrong in this verse. God never told him to take an oath and to tell his army to fast on a day when they are fighting. This was simply a big mistake doing it his way. God didn't bless it. In fact, it turned out to be a very negative thing. But this shows a pattern of Saul doing it his own way, not seeking God, but instead trying to decide he could sort of halfway obey, halfway do his own thing, and hope that it would turn out right. Verse 25, all the people of the land came to a forest. Now, another interesting thing in verse 24 is Saul is taking credit for it himself. He doesn't say until God has delivered Israel or until our Creator, our God, has given us victory. He says, until I have taken vengeance on my enemies. And we find that Saul often, in the accounts we have of him, is very, very concerned about his own image, his own credit. Who gets the credit? He wants the credit for it, and he hesitates to give credit to God, who is the one who really gave them the victory. Verse 25, all the people of the land came to a forest, and there was honey on the ground. So there must have been some trees in there that had beehives in them. When the people had come into the woods, there was the honey dripping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with this oath. Therefore he stretched out the end of his rod that was in his hand and dipped it in a honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his countenance brightened. So the sugar, whatever, the nourishment in the honey made him feel a little bit better. One of the people said, your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, cursed is the man who eats food this day. And the people were faint. But Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. Look now how my countenance has brightened, because I tasted of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies, which they found. For now would there not have been a much greater slaughter among the Philistines. So they drove back the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, and the people were very faint. So the people rushed on the spoil, took sheep, oxen, and calves, and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. So the fast caused people to be famished, to be desperately hungry, and they began to eat here before actually bleeding properly and roasting the animals. They told Saul, saying, "Look, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with blood." He said, "You have dealt treacherously. Roll a large stone to me this day." So he wanted a stone apparently to do some killing on. Then Saul said, "Disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, bring me every man's ox and every man's sheep. Slaughter them here and eat, and do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood." So verse 35, Saul built an altar to the Lord. This was the first altar that he built to the Lord. Again, Saul was not qualified to build an altar. He should have called the priests and had them do it, and had it done according as it should have been done. So we have Saul here making a very big mistake. He relied on himself, and of course, Saul and Jonathan, verse 42, Saul said, "Cast lots between me and Jonathan." Behold, Jonathan was taken, so that's how he found out that Jonathan had eaten the honey. And Saul said to Jonathan, "What have you done?" Jonathan said, "I have only tasted a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand, so now I must die." Saul answered, "God do so and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan." So Saul was willing to kill his own son. This is an odd scripture to me. How could someone think that violation is worth the death penalty? But the people, of course, didn't want that to happen. The people complained to Saul, and he relented, and Jonathan did not die that day, thankfully. But it was a silly oath. But it was his sin that had separated him from God, because if you go back to verse 35, let's go down to verse 37. Saul asked counsel of God and said, "Shall I go down to the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the hand of Israel?" But he did not answer him that day. So you see a pattern here in what happens. When we rely upon ourselves, make our own decisions, partially obey God, God goes somewhere else. He turns a deaf ear to our prayers. He doesn't respond to our requests. So Saul then brought his chiefs over, or people, and asked them about some advice. But God turning off his contact with Saul is no big surprise, because God wants a pure heart. He wants those to worship him out of sincerity and truth, not just partially, and not making silly decisions based upon their own ideas along the way. So Saul's pattern here is not praying for God's help, not seeking guidance, but doing things his own way, making his own assumptions. And of course, the final result is that he is simply rejected by God. Now let's look at Saul's third test. These are the three tests we have in the book of Samuel. We began in chapter 15 here, when God finally said, "Okay, let's give him one more chance. Let's see if he will learn to obey what I say to do." Down in verse 9. Well, let's start in verse 8, because that's where we left off last time. Saul attacked the Amalekites. He won the battle. But verse 8, he took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive. Now, why did he do that? Why didn't he kill Agag like he was supposed to? Well, the answer is he wanted to parade Agag around as a trophy. That was very common in the ancient world, where they would, the Romans especially, would always spare the leaders, and they would put them on carts, take them down to Rome, and when they had their big triumph or celebration, when they paraded around town, they would parade all these defeated kings in these wagons, and then strangle them at the end of the parade. So there was I guess you might say, a historical precedent, although this happened long before ancient Rome, but it was still common that they would parade the defeated leaders around as some sort of a trophy, saying, "Look what we did, we defeated them." So Saul spared Agag, and it says in verse 9, the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to destroy them. But everything despised and worthless they utterly destroyed. So they very definitely disobeyed the direct command of God that all the Amalekites and all of their animals should be destroyed. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel. God said this, "I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me. He has not performed my commandments." And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul went up to Carmel. Indeed, he has set up a monument for himself. So Saul here wants to be admired by the people. Once again, he wants the focus of attention, the glory, to be on him. It doesn't say he went to the priests and asked if he could thank God, or an offering could be given on his behalf to thank God for the victory, for giving God the victory for this, or the credit for this victory. No, Saul went to the highest mountain in northern Israel, the highest point, and made a monument to himself. Kind of strange, isn't it? But that's what he did. It does tell us a great deal about his own vanity and pride. He has gone on around, passed by, and has gone down to Gilgal. That's where he was from. Then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord. So Saul sees Samuel, and he walks up and says, Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. This is a bold-faced lie. He knew he hadn't. He knew he had partially done what he was supposed to do and disobeyed the rest of it. But he comes to Samuel, and because he's been rationalizing in his mind how he's going to justify this to Samuel, this is what he says. But Samuel then said, Well, what then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen which I hear? Well, I said, what are all these animals that I hear making noise around here? Samuel said, verse 15, Saul said, Well, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen. So here he begins to shift blame. Instead of saying, I gave them permission, or I wanted them to spare the best because I wanted them for my own flocks or my herds or whatever, or to give as a reward for the army, he begins to blame the army, begins to blame others. Says, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and oxen. Notice a very religious sounding justification. To sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. It's kind of an aspect of human nature that comes up quite often, that people who are doing something they know is desperately wrong, and in defiance of God, have a religious sounding reason for doing so. I've noticed that from time to time over the years with people who have a, quote, religious sounding reason for no longer being a part of God's church. It's always sort of, kind of a goofed up thing in their head, but there's a religious sounding reason for justifying what they've done. And so Saul here did the same thing. He said, well, we did this to sacrifice to God. We disobeyed God in order to sacrifice sheep to him. I guess the disconnect never met in Saul's mind. Then Samuel said to Saul, be quiet. He didn't listen to his argument. He didn't try to say anything. It's like, arguing with the kid. You don't get anywhere. So Samuel said to Saul, be quiet, and I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And Saul said, well, speak on. So Samuel said, when you were little in your own eyes, were you not the head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you to be king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. So when you were humble, God chose you to be king. And now God has given you a fairly simple job to do, a task to perform. Verse 19, why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? Now, verse 20 is an interesting reaction because Saul here is still lying to himself. He's still trying to convince Samuel. Saul said to Samuel, but I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. Just like a dog that partially obeys and says, well, I'm doing what I was told to do, right? Not always. And gone on the mission which the Lord sent me, and brought back Agag, king of the Amalekites. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. And of course, that wasn't true. He had not utterly destroyed them. But the people took up the plunder, the sheep, and the oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice. So, well, the people made a problem. The people sinned. They should have destroyed all that. To sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. So he's going back now to try to justify it with a religious-sounding excuse. Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? It's very true. It applies to us even today. What pleases God is obeying the voice of the Lord. It isn't in offerings. It isn't in climbing the highest mountain or swimming the deepest river. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed, to listen and do to what God says than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, the most heinous of sins, the same as rebellion. And stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Of course, Saul then changes his mind once he's been punished. People often repent because they don't want the penalty to be carried out. We find this often with politicians and criminals who are caught. All of a sudden they repent because they want to avoid the penalty that is naturally going to accrue. So Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me, that I may worship the Lord. So here we have Saul saying, well, let's just forgive and forget. I'm sorry, let's cover up. Let's pretend none of this happened. Verse 26, Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from becoming king or being king over Israel. Now we find that Samuel was walking away, and Saul grabbed a piece of his robe. And God says, well, I've torn the kingdom of Israel from you and given it to a man that God is pleased with. So this account of how a talented, very tall man lost his throne and his chance to have it established forever is one that we simply cannot forget. Saul had a number of very serious sins that we have read and understood today. He wanted to parade Agag around like a trophy. He wanted to blame others for his disobedience, wanted to blame the people. He wanted to justify it with religious-sounding reasons. He wanted to be seen by men. He wanted to have the glory and admiration of men, which we are warned about in the Bible is a great poison. I want to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 12. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, God warns, one of many places, by the way, where this warning is given to us, that God wants us to observe exactly what he says. He does not want us to use human reason to add to or to take away from what he says. He doesn't want us to add our own traditions, multiply the days that he wants us to keep. He doesn't want us to say we have a number of regulations beyond what he says. He wants us simply to do as he has commanded. Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 32, whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it or take away from it. This is one of the important verses to remember when you read about various ways of going back to Judaism. If you think about what is the Talmud is huge, voluminous violations of this verse. It is simply adding the ideas of men to the laws of God, or taking away from the laws of God by the ideas of men. And that's why the mixing of Judaism and Christianity is so toxic, because it is simply a violation. Let's also go over to Joshua chapter 1 and verse 7. Joshua warned the people as he began his time and also as he ended it, that they were not to add to, they were not to take away from the laws that God had given them. Joshua chapter 1 and verse 7, be strong and very courageous, that you may observe and do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left. Don't add to it in the right hand, don't take away, that would be on the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. But it was the book of the law. This law shall not depart out of your mouth. And he continues that later, but certainly we need to make sure that we understand that's exactly what King Saul did. He took away from the laws of God, the commands of God, with his own human reason. He became a person who partially obeyed. In the New Testament, there are also some examples. Let's just go over to John chapter 12. Where we have these religious leaders that had this same sin. John chapter 12, beginning in verse 42. We have a group of Pharisees who believed in their halakha, their walk, their religious leaders. Jesus Christ called it their tradition, which replaced the laws of God. And too often, even in modern day religion, there is tradition, there are ideas that replace the laws of God and keep people from really obeying They have a religion of partial obedience in one way or another. In John chapter 12 and verse 42, John writes, "Nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him." They kept their honoring or their belief in Jesus Christ and his teachings quiet. They kept it secret, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. Notice the reason. For they love the praise of men more than the praise of God. So they kept quiet about their believing the words of Jesus Christ because they wanted the praise of men more than the praise of God. You know, Jesus Christ said in the Sermon on the Mount, if you are ashamed of him in front of men, he'll be ashamed of you in front of your Father who is in heaven. And the opposite of true. If we are honest and proud and make it, or at least wise, are honest about our belief in him and his teachings in front of men, he will also confess us before his Father who was in heaven. But these Pharisees loved the praise of men, just like King Saul did. There's a good example of that, I think, is a good warning for us. Let's go to 3 John verse 3. 3 John verse 3. These examples are here because they are still relevant today. Human nature has not changed. Satan, the devil, hasn't changed. His way that he tempts us, his false ideas and idolatry that the world has around us that we often fall for, haven't changed since the very first days, really, of Adam and Eve. 3 John verse 3, this epistle is written as a very specific slice of what he wanted to say. He's addressing a very specific issue. Now he writes at the end of this book, "I had many things to write, but I do not wish to write to you with pen and ink." Now, I wish he would have taken the time with pen and ink to write a much longer letter. It's kind of like the Apostle Paul saying, "The things I can't write to you now, we'll do it later." I mean, you say, okay, why did you frustrate us? You know, I saw things in heaven that I can't write down in his vision, of course. So let's look what 3 John is written about. Verse 3, "I rejoiced greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth." So he's happy that they were continuing to walk in the truth they had been taught. "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children," those he had taught, baptized, brought up in the faith, "walk in the truth. Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers." So then he mentions, though, that there were issues, there were problems. Verse 7, "Because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles." He's talking about people who were bearing witness for the church, who were sacrificing their own finances and well-being for the furthering of the gospel. Verse 8, he says, "We ought to receive those because that we may become fellow workers of the truth." But verse 9 is really the point of the book. "I wrote to the church, but Diotrophies, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us." So Diotrophies, like the Pharisees, had an outward show of religion. He went through the motions of obeying God. He went through the motions, perhaps, of keeping the Sabbath, of attending services, of tithing, doing all the things that would be outward shows. But inwardly, his motivation was to have preeminence among people, preeminence among the brethren, just as King Saul wanted to have the image he made to himself or the monument he made to himself, and he wanted to parade Agag around saying, "See what I have done, I have gotten this great victory," when of course God had gotten it for him. So Diotrophies is a warning, because it wouldn't be in here if it wasn't, that all of us must be careful of, that we do not have a type of religion or don't pollute our true religion by making this a part of it, wanting to have the preeminence among the brethren. Verse 10, "Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds, which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren and forbids those who wish, putting them out of the church." So here we have a bad example in the very, very late in the chronology of the New Testament, maybe in the 80s or early 90s AD. So there were already some issues happening that would have been along this category of partially obeying God for whatever reason they come up with. Now, the way to prevent it is also giving to us. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3 and verse 1. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 1. If we're not careful, these type of sin could gradually come into our life. But thankfully, we are given some admonitions to keep our mind, you might say, focused in the right direction, that we ought to be thinking those things about the kingdom of God. And had a couple of good talks this week with Mark Welch, our director of church administration, a good friend of mine for many years, went to college with. And we're talking about some of the positive things that have happened despite the COVID crisis, despite the panic and all that has happened. And the one thing we both noticed, independently, him back in Ohio, me out here, is that Sabbath conversation is more spiritually oriented. People are talking more about how we don't have that much time and the condition that we need to be in to make sure we're ready for the kingdom of God. So, and I told them over the years, I've had a number of concerns about our Sabbath conversation, which God says is holy time, being used for physical things and talking about too many things that are not spiritually oriented. And so he agreed. He said, well, there are a few good things that have happened to the church because of the COVID issue, and perhaps that's one of them. But that's a fulfillment of Colossians chapter 3 and verse 1. If you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. So seek those things that are above, not things on this earth. That's why we don't get involved in political movements. We don't go down and demonstrate. We don't get involved in this or that. We don't ride around in pickup trucks, waving flags and shooting guns in the air. We keep our mind on things that are above, not things on this earth. For you died, your previous existence died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. So that's the real focus of what we ought to be thinking about. Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth. Fornication seems to always be listed first, as sexual sin in all the lists of sins in the New Testament. Uncleanness, passion, evil desire, that would be exalting self, would be an evil desire. Covetousness, coveting preeminence, coveting things, greed, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming on the sons of disobedience. Because of all of those sins, the wrath of God is coming on the earth. But he says in verse 8, but now you yourselves are to put off all these, anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. In other words, we are to put or to mortify that sin out of our bodies. Interesting that oftentimes these sins are listed with a warning about the coming punishment for those sins, either nationally or even on an individual basis. But it is a very challenging thing to live in this society, because he says in verse 6, because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. So he's telling them to come out of the world, come out of society, make sure that we are obeying God from the heart, not from just an outward example or outward religious hypocrisy. Let's go over to find out what happens. What's the final result of partial obedience? I want to go over to 1 Samuel chapter 18. 1 Samuel chapter 18. We read how God had refused to hear Samuel's prayer, not prayer, but request for guidance, because he had relied on himself so long. God says, well, you are so accustomed to relying on yourself, you can just do it on your own. But it actually is much worse than that. If we justify being partially obedient to God, eventually we're going to be turned over to a satanic influence. Our goal, of course, is to be wanting to completely do what God says and trusting in him no matter what. And if you've raised dogs, you know that if you work with the dog enough, they come to that place for the most part. I've had dogs that had a little bit of stubbornness that lasted a long time. My current dog, Stella, who's 14 and is certainly in the twilight of her days, when she was about 5, maybe 6 years old, she got to the place that no matter what I told her, she did it. I mean, her only purpose in life was to please me, to keep me happy. I remember one time we came to a ditch and I had to open this barbed wire fence and tell her to jump through in the darkness. And she did not have any idea what was on the other side of that ditch. And she looked at me and I said, no, Stella, jump, go. And so she's like, well, he's my master. I'm going to do it, even though I'm very afraid. And she did. It was fine. They were land just a foot or two down on the other side. But a number of times I've told her to do things that she looks at me like, I don't understand how this is going to turn out good, but because you say to do it, we're going to do it. And it's nice to have a dog that comes to that point, that all they want to do is just please you and do what's right. How much more wonderful is it from God's perspective to see his servants who have a real desire to please him, and no matter what the costs or the consequences. And we're not dogs, but the principle is still the same. We're all in training, and we are all learning how to obey completely, not just partially. But a sad epitaph here in 1 Samuel chapter 18, beginning in verse 9. Well, here, let's begin in verse 8, because this again shows that Saul had been encompassed with jealousy, overcome with jealousy. Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me only thousands. So he was very jealous and envious that somebody else got the credit. Of course, somebody else won the victory, but in this case, he was simply jealous because he wanted the accolades of men. Verse 9, so Saul eyed David from that day forward, and it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hands at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand. And continuing on down through the story that we'll just leave for later, God allowed a demon to torment King Saul for the rest of his life. It's incredible when you think about it, because at one point in Saul's life, he actually was influenced greatly by the Spirit of God. At one point, he was prophesying with all the other prophets, and God used him for a number of years to defeat the enemies of Israel. But because of his habit of only partially obeying, not completely obeying, we find that eventually God rejected him and left him to the influence of Satan and his demons. I want to go over to Romans chapter 1 now, just because it's kind of historical. This is one of those incredibly profound chapters in the Bible that is a summary of the history of mankind. There are some that believe that he's referring to the deities of ancient Greece that are pretty much engraved on the side of the Parthenon, especially the parts of the Parthenon that have been taken to other nations where they took the fascia and various places off of it. But there's a story of the Greeks rejecting God and man becoming his own God, which is quite vividly illustrated in the Parthenon and other Greek statues. So was Paul talking about this particular building when he wrote this? We don't know. It was still standing. It was one of the longest standing ancient beautiful buildings in history. It wasn't destroyed until it was destroyed, believe it or not, by the Venetians in the 1600s with a barrage of naval gunfire back then. What surpassed or what passed as naval gunfire, but in one of their wars with the Turks. At any rate, Romans 1 is about God rejecting man, and then man living on his own. Man rejecting God, and then God eventually letting man just go on his own, and eventually coming to the place that human reason and human government and sin often does. So chapter 1 of Romans, let's just begin down a little bit farther than the beginning. Verse 20, for the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. And certainly when you see the sun and the stars and the beauty and the incredible precision of the coordination, we see some of the, we understand a little bit about the nature of God and his precision and his beauty, his love of beauty, and his creative power. It says, they're understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. So they are without excuse if they believe that God does not exist. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their hearts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. It's a history of mankind over and over and over again, rejecting God and creating their own idols, their own things to worship. Therefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God, the truth that's revealed in his creation, for the lie that man is God, or that Satan is to be worshiped. It says, and worshiped and served the creation rather than the creator. And of course, the result of all of that is given in the last part of the chapter. And so we have kind of a history of mankind's rejecting of God over and over and over again, a summary here in this very perceptive and prescient chapter. And we see it taking place in our land. The challenge for us is to make sure that we are serving God from the heart and that we are not going to partially obey, but give it our goal to make sure that we are completely obeying God. So here we have a very big challenge. We have a world that's coming apart in chaos. We have, in some cases, other things to face that we've never faced before. We can go home at night and we can watch riots, murders, chaos in real time. You know, when I was a paper boy years and years ago, that's back when people read newspapers, and even before that, in the really dark ages, newspapers hired boys who were 12, 13, 14 to carry big bags of newspapers around on their shoulder. You'd waddle around like a turtle until you got rid of most of them and delivered them 7 days a week to people who subscribed to the paper. But back in the days of the Vietnam War, when I was a paper boy, the early days of the war, the news was footage that they shot over in Saigon or in Vietnam, and they would then put the reels of film on an airplane, and they would, I think, develop the reels on the airplane on the way back to Los Angeles, and then they would play that tape the next night. So to get battle scenes or something out of Vietnam within 24 hours, we consider that to be quite the miracle. But how different is that today? You know, somebody with a cell phone who's posting on Facebook can show the whole world in real time. You know, murders, chaos, burnings being built, all sorts of things going on. And so there is an effect. It has a numbing effect to our human emotions. It does take its toll on us. We just need to make sure that we are above that, don't fill our minds too much with it, because I think perhaps there's kind of an attraction in some cases. Let's go over to Joshua chapter 23 to finish up for today. At the end of Joshua's life, and as you read so many accounts in the scriptures about what great men of God said as their final words. You know, the final words of David, we have those ensconced in song, you know, he that rules over men must be just, but that really isn't the final words. I mean, some of them. You know, what was David's final psalm that he wrote? Where does it say the writings or the psalms of David are ended? It's at the end of Psalm 72. And so Psalm 72 is a wonderful psalm. It's a great one to read during the feast because it's all about, he's thinking about the kingdom of God. He's thinking about Christ ruling the earth. He's thinking about the wonderful things to come. And that would be the final words of David, final thoughts of David, you might say. In this case, the final thoughts of Joshua 23, beginning in verse 1. It came to pass a long time after the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua was old, advanced in age. He was 110 years old. Joshua called for all Israel, for their elders, for their heads, for their judges, for their officers, and said, I am old, advanced in age. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you, for the Lord your God is he who fought for you. See, I have divided to you by lot these nations that remain, to be an inheritance for your tribes from the Jordan with all the nations that I have cut off as far as the great sea westward. And the Lord your God will expel them from before you and drive them out of your sight, so you shall possess their land as the Lord your God promised you. And of course, going into the promised land was a type, was a sort of a sneak into the future about the eternal promised land that God has given us, promised to us. Well, he says in verse 6, a warning. Therefore be very courageous to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, lest you turn aside from the right hand or to the left. In other words, to completely obey what God has said. Don't blend it with human reason and human ideas. Don't partially obey, but completely obey those commandments and commitments that God had for us. Down in verse 8, it says, you shall hold fast to the Lord your God as you have done this day. So we have that commitment. We have the feast coming up. We have God's holy days in the fall, all 4 of them, to look forward to here soon. And let's keep them in sincerity and truth and never allow partial obedience to ruin our Christianity.